Hello, I'm Kranti from Extra Guru. I will be presenting designing and implementing triggers and user-defined functions. In this module, I will describe more details about different types of triggers and user-defined functions which T SQL supports. Trigger is a special kind of stored procedure that automatically executes when an event occurs in the database server. The trigger supports two types of events in a SQL Server. When any data manipulation events like insert or delete, or any data definition events like a create, alter, or drop table statements. T SQL support two types of triggers, which are DDL trigger, DML trigger. DML trigger execute when user try to modify data through the data manipulation language, which is insert, update, or delete statements. And also, the triggers fire when any valid event is fired, regardless of whether or any table rows are affected or not. But basically, the DDL trigger is executed in a response to a variety of data definition language like a create, alter, drop statement, and also certain system store procedure that perform the data definition language operations like operators, logins, or any other events. Let's take a look more details about each of the trigger. The DML trigger supports two types of triggers: after trigger, instead of trigger. Instead of trigger fire before any SQL statement execution occurred. Basically, this is completely different from the after trigger. We can use the instead of trigger when the insert, update, delete trigger on the table that successfully executed, but it doesn't include the actual insert, update, delete to the table. We can have an instead of insert, update, delete trigger on the table that successfully executed, but does not include the actual insert, update, delete to the table. If you insert a record or row in a table, then the trigger related with that insert event on this table will fire before row passes to the all constraints. For example, if you want to insert any row into the table, that makes sure if you want to verify that the row is going to be inserted correctly or not. So before it is going insert into the all constraints such as a primary key or any certain rules, then instead of trigger will fire before pass through that constraints. And if record or rows insertion fail to violate some particular rules or any constraint, then the instead of trigger will fire automatically before you insert the row. After trigger will fire after the SQL statement executed. So the basically the after trigger is mostly used in the tables and instead of trigger used mostly in the view side. So the after trigger, the trigger code execute either if you try to insert or delete it or update it, but the trigger will fire after the completion of the insert and delete statements. But if any constraint is violated like foreign key or primary key, then the statement will fail and trigger will not execute it. And also there are certain rules for the trigger that the trigger execute only once regardless of how many rows you're trying to insert or update in your table. And the schema of the trigger must be the same as the schema of the table or view in the trigger associated with. You can use the DML triggers for auditing, enforce complex integrity. There are many more options that I will show you into the demonstration how it works. And both types of DML triggers execute as a part of the transaction associated with the insert, update, or any delete statements. DDL triggers fire when you try to work on any data definition language events such as create a table, alter a table, or drop or creating any databases or any other data definition events. And also if the SQL Server has any system stored procedure which perform any DDL operations, also the DDL trigger fire when event occurs. The DDL triggers have two types: the transact SQL DDL trigger and CLR DDL trigger. If you try to work any T SQL DDL operations like alter, dropping the table, then the transact SQL DDL trigger fire when you during the data definition events occur. And also the DDL trigger support, CLR DDL triggers, which if you work anything with the .NET framework, then the CLR trigger execute one or more methods written managed with your .NET Core assembly. Let's take a look into the quick demo how the DDL trigger works. Here I have a database and I'm going to create a small table that employee underscore trigger. And after that, I am going to create a small trigger that if you try to do any drop table or alter table, then it will fire the trigger. So the basic syntax for the trigger is create trigger and trigger name. On if you try to do the specific database name, then you have to do on the database level. If you are trying to do on the server level, for example, here we are going to create another trigger for the server level. If you try to do any new database, then the trigger will fire automatically. See, first let's take a look into the database level. So here I have the trigger on the database for the what are the data definition commands you are going to trigger. Currently we are working on drop table and also the alter table. So let me create a table first, then the table is already existed in my server. Now I'm going to create a trigger. That trigger will fire when you try to do any drop or alter the table. So now the trigger is created. If I run the drop table statement, now you see that you must disable the trigger, the safety and drop or alter table. So you must disable the trigger safety to do the drop or alter the tables. And that's how the trigger works. And now here I have another DDL trigger that if any database creation operation occurred on the SQL Server instance, then that trigger will fire. So basically create a trigger name on all server, which means we are trying to do on the server level. Before trigger it was on the database level because we are working on the table operations, but here we are working on the database level. If if any database is created on the server, then automatically the trigger will fire. See, let's take a look. Now I'm going to create a trigger. Now if I want to create any new database, then the trigger will automatically fire it. So if I run this, now you see that the message is displayed that database is created and the following statement. So we have a different kind of schema structures is displayed when you create a database. So now I just want to be drop that database. After the DDL trigger, now I'm going to be drop the trigger what we were created. So the basically we created two types of triggers here. One is based on the database level, another is based on the server level. Now let's take a look into the different types of the DML triggers. So before I jump into it, I have to be drop the table again that we are created for the DDL triggers. Now so the table is dropped, and again I just have to be when I try to do that again it is asking us to be disable that trigger. So now basically we are going to be drop the trigger again, and then we are going to be drop the table. So before I go here, I just have to be now I'm going to be drop the trigger that it is going to be disabled. Now after that I'm going to be dropping the table. So now that if you wants to do any operations, then you have to be do the drop or disable the trigger, then you can it is allow us to drop the table. So now let's go into our DML triggers. So and now I have to create a table again, and I'm inserting the rows. So we inserted few rows on the table, and we are going to be created second table. Now let's focus on to the after insert trigger first, that if any insert operation occurred, then it will fire the trigger after the insert is completed. If any insert are failed before you complete the transaction, then the trigger after trigger is not going to be worked. So the same syntax, create a trigger and trigger name on the specific table for insert. So if you wants to do the update, then you can just put for update. So currently we are trying to work on insert. If you can use the multiple on the same time, insert comma update comma delete, but I want to show you the each of the trigger operations for the demonstration purpose. So now I'm going to create the trigger, and then I'm going to select the values from the physical table. Then after the insert, then the trigger will fire. So let's create a trigger on the database. Then we are going to be insert the rows. Now you see that after inserting operation is complete, then the after insert trigger fired. So the message it is displaying when use completed. Now let's take a look into the rows that we added additional row on here, that the employee underscore trigger table. So basically we have the silo 1000 employment salary. So now let's take a look into the another trigger, that here I'm performing the delete and update statements on the same trigger, that if any delete or update operations occurred, then automatically the current trigger will fire. So the basic syntax, create a trigger, trigger name on the table for delete comma update. So earlier trigger we created only basically for just one insert, but here we are currently focusing on delete and also the update. So if both any operation performed, then automatically the current trigger will fire. So now I am trying to execute this trigger is already existed in my current database. So now let's see that the delete from the table, if I do any kind of operation, then automatically the trigger is going to be fired. So one row is affected on the table, then after then also we display the after delete update trigger fired. So now let's take a look into the rows that we don't have a employee ID 5 here. So the row is, instead of trigger, basically it fires before you execution happened. For example, if you try to do any insert operation, if you want to track the records for auditing purpose, like if any records are violating the rules or any primary constraints, so then the trigger, the instead of trigger will help a lot before you insert any operation. So if any operation is incorrect, like any values are incorrect or violating the primary key or foreign key constraint, then instead of trigger will fire automatically before you execute or insert the row into a table. Now I'm going to create a trigger, that the same syntax, create a trigger and trigger name on the table instead of insert. So currently we are performing insert operation. If any insert is wrong data, then it will throw an error and it will give fire the trigger automatically before even insert the data into the table. Now if I run the trigger, now I'm going to run the two insert statements. Now you will see that you cannot insert the salaries where it's below 1000. So and also the statement has been terminated because of that. The trigger name is automatically fired when you run the statement. You see that the trigger instead of insert. So this is very helpful when you perform the audit purpose, and also it is mostly very helpful if you try to insert the rows through the SQL Server view. So basically the instead of trigger will fire before you insert the data, but after trigger what we talked earlier, that any delete or update, these triggers will fire after the insert or any operation is complete. So you have to remember that the difference between them. Now you see that we have a same rows, it is not affected any data because the trigger is fired before the insert operation. Now we are going to create instead of trigger for update statement. So if you try to do any update, then the trigger will fire if anything violating the rules for the table definition or any other table constraint values. So let's go ahead and create another trigger for update statement. So the basic syntax is same: create a trigger name on the table name. Instead of that, we are going to use update statement, as then you can do the different kind of performance operations as you need it. So now I'm going to create the trigger. Now let's try to do the update operations. Then again you will get the same trigger fired, that this time we have a different trigger name here, that trigger instead of update. Our earlier trigger was instead of insert, but this time it is fired instead of update. So which means any update. So these are the rules violated again, that when it is not going to be inserted if it is salary is less than 1000. So now I'm going to select the rows again, that the rows are not affected because the performance or any new data is not inserted. User defined functions are T SQL or CLR routines that they can accept the input parameters and return the different values in terms of the single value or maybe the multiple values in terms of table format. The purpose of the user defined function is to encapsulate the reusable T SQL code and return the scalar or table values to the caller. For example, if you are trying to use a specific condition, then you're trying to get the results based on the parameter, then it's better to use that. The user defined function will help you to a lot of flexibility other than the stored procedures. So I will show you the quick demo how the user defined function works. And basically you cannot use the execute command to call that user defined function. You have to use it in select statement. That select statement will call the function and it will return the value based on the function. Now there are two types of functions, that scalar function or table value function. Scalar function, which is you can pass the parameter value and it will return you the single value. The scalar user defined function can appear anywhere in the query. There you can use into the different kind of expressions to return the single value. All the code within the scalar user defined function must be enclosed with the begin and end block. The table value function returns the table values rather than the single values to the caller. When it can be called in a T SQL query where the table is expected, but you have to be used in the from class. And the inline table value function is the only type of function that it can be written without any begin and end block. Multiple statement table value user defined function has a return statement that end of the function body. User defined functions cannot perform any schema or data changes in the database, and also it cannot create or access the temporary tables, and it cannot call the store procedure, and also the user defined functions cannot perform the execute dynamic SQL. Here I have two types of function. That let's work with the scalar function. So the basically the function syntax is create a function and function name. Then you have to provide the parameter value with the returns, and you have to define that this function should be returned the integer data type as. So this is the basic syntax. Then you again you have to start with the begin and end block. So now when I run this function, the SQL Server will create a function. Then instead of the SQL Server store procedure, we use the execute command. But here we are not going to be used any execute, just we are calling from the select statement. So what we are trying to do, we are using the function and the passing the value of the product ID. So when you get the product ID from this table for each time, then it will get the product ID each time and call the store procedure, call the function, then it will retrieve the result. So if I run this, then you will get the values as a current supply. So which means you, instead of getting the calculations in your select statement, you are define the different select statement in the function with the parameter value. So then you are calling that function in the select statement, then you will get the returns for each value of the row. So this is it returning the each single row for this function returns the single value for each row. Now if you want to return into the multiple values, then you have to create a function with the table value function. Let's see the difference between the scalar function and table value function. The syntax is, then you have to use the return integer, but here you are using the return table as again return. So there is a small syntax difference when you use the table value function and also the scalar function. Now if I use this, now I'm using the similar like a table instead of using the select class, that now here we are using as a table with the parameter value. So if I select this, then it will retrieve the multiple values based on the table value function. So every time when I pass the value store ID, then it will give you, it will call the function define the specific select statement, then it will execute the select statement based on the function. So if I run this, now you will see the values are displaying based on the single value. So now if you defined any single value here, then you will get the single results. So now if I run this and I just want to be change it to the product ID, the product ID might be different. So now I want to change it to the 2. If I run the procedure, now you see that each product ID has a value. But when you run the table value function, you will get the single value with the single parameter value. You will get the entire table value results. So the basically the scalar function will used you return the single value, but table value function will use it to return the table value results. So and also there is a difference to call the function. If you are using the scalar function, then you have to be used in the select class. Then if you are using the table value function, then you have to call. We learned the different types of triggers in this module, the DML and DDL trigger. The DML trigger basically used it to any data manipulation language events, and DDL trigger used any data definition events in a T SQL. And DML are the two types, instead of and after the trigger. After trigger is fire if any action performed in a T SQL. Instead of trigger will fire before any execution operation occurred in a T SQL. After that we learned different types of functions and the scalar and table value function, that the scalar value function will return the single value, then table value function will return the multiple values. And also we learn how to call the user defined and table value functions with the different select statements.